Very good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to Summer University for our regular forum on the Jeffrey Chancellor of Southeast Asian Studies. This afternoon we have a very interesting and important topic, and that is the administration of Jokowi, the newly inaugurated president of Indonesia. Indonesia, of course, matters in this region. Not only it is the biggest country in the region, but it's only the only country in ASEAN that is the G20. And we have a great speaker this afternoon who knows Indonesia inside out. So very short introduction of Ahmad-Noor. Dr. Farish is Associate Professor and Head of the Doctoral Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at the Nanyang Technological University. He has lectured at several universities in Paris, Leiden, and Berlin, and also has been attached as a visiting professor to several leading universities in Indonesia. He specialized on the development of states and society across Southeast Asia, especially on the evolution of religio-political movements in the region. In Malaysia, he is more widely known as the author of the two-volume, 842-page long book called Islam Embedded, the historical development of the Pan-Malaysian Islamic Party. And I have to admit here, I haven't finished reading it yet. But what you may not know about Farish is that he's also a TV star. He is the host of a TV program called Inside Indonesia with Dr. Farish, currently being shown on Channel News Asia. And I'm sure you can watch it on YouTube. Before I hand the podium over to Farish, I would like to acknowledge the Central Intelligence Agency for providing this beautiful map of Indonesia. I stole it from the website. But I've just been told by Farish that this is actually an outdated map. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Farish now to share his thoughts with us on the new Jokowi administration.
Thank you very much, James. I'm also available for weddings and birthday parties. Much of what I'll be talking about will be anecdotal, because I would like to give you a ground level understanding of the socio-economic realities, socio-cultural realities of Indonesia today. Because the title of the talk is The Challenges Facing this New Administration. Can Jokowi deliver? Let's skip all the preliminaries. We know there's a new cabinet, there are some interesting new names. Retno Lestari is the new Minister of Foreign Affairs. Some interesting names, Lutfi Saifuddin from EPP as the Minister of Religious Affairs. I think this is an interesting composition, but the challenges that face the government of Indonesia, Jokowi's administration, will be complex, and the complex nature of these challenges reflect the complexity of Indonesian society. I think those of us who view Indonesia as our neighbor, particularly those of us in Malaysia, Singapore, tend to make two common mistakes. One, the assumption that there is a certain homogeneity to Indonesia, which we know can't really be sustained. Indonesia is a vast country, it's the size of Europe, the population bigger than that of the United States, I think, at the moment. But also, there's a tendency to view Indonesia through the lens of Jakarta, and to somehow assume in a very sort of classical neo-realist paradigm that, when we talk about nation states, we're talking about central governments that wield power and have the power to translate policy from the central level to the provincial level very easily. Well, one look at the outdated CIA map will tell you that Indonesia is a country that is by virtue of its demography and its geography, a country that is vast and complex. It covers 3 time zones, it's the width of Europe. But the advantage that some of us have working in Southeast Asia, and one of the reasons why I left Germany to come to Singapore, because being in Southeast Asia means we can do a lot of field work. And I think what is very much required for a better understanding of the countries of Southeast Asia is fieldwork, and there's not enough fieldwork being done. So I speak as someone who tries to connect the big picture with the small picture on the ground, and I speak as someone who has literally crossed this map of Indonesia. So when asking the question of what the Jokowi administration can deliver, what it can actually deliver to the ordinary voters, the ordinary people of Indonesia, we need to understand the state of Indonesian society, and we begin with the premise that there is no singular Indonesian society. It is a complex society that exists on multiple levels, with very different socio-economic, socio-political realities depending on which part of Indonesia you're in. So I'll start off with some anecdotes. Start with Kalimantan. When looking at Kalimantan politics today, those who look at Indonesia through the lens of Jakarta, and this is a fundamental mistake that a lot of scholars and students do. To read about Indonesia, they read Jakarta Post or Jakarta Globe or whatever. If you want to know Indonesia, you must understand that even in terms of the journalistic landscape of Indonesia, the local press is actually far more important than the national press. In many parts of Indonesia, local newspapers have more sway than the national newspapers. So a newspaper like Jakarta Post, good though it is, I know the editors, these are my friends, but good though it is, doesn't give you the full picture of what's going on the ground. If you look at Kalimantan today is very much a very different Kalimantan from what it was in the past. Very few people realize that the third fastest growing city in Indonesia at the moment is Balikpapan. After Jakarta, Surabaya, Balikpapan, which is here. And yet, when we look at the realities on the ground in East Kalimantan, many of the issues that Jokowi has raised in his election campaign, the need to improve logistics, the need to improve communications, the need to deliver goods and services, including healthcare and education, these become very clear when you're in the outer provinces. If you start from Balikpapan, you go up the Borneo Highway to Samarinda, and you go up the Mahakam River all the way to interior Kalimantan, you will note that prices begin to rise. Prices begin to rise. Prices begin to rise simply because that Kalimantan is very much dependent upon basic necessities that are imported from Java. Now, if you've been following the election campaign, you'll know that one of the things that Jokowi wants to put across to the Indonesian people is the need for a new logistical program for the country. The much touted, maritime zone that he's talking about. This is a direct challenge to the business cartels that have evolved and developed over time, and that accounts for how and why costs begin to rise the further deep you go inland into the provinces. So you start off in a place like Samarinda or Balikpapan, and prices are the same as in Jakarta or Yogyakarta, but as you go further and further inland, once you reach Kutai, for instance, the prices double. Then you go further inland into Long Iram, Long Inung, it goes up 3 times, 4 times, and that's only because of the profits that are being made by the logistical companies, the transport companies that transport oil, gas, rice, sugar, etc., etc. So that tells you something about the local realities on the ground as far as ordinary Indonesians are concerned. Adding to that complexity, of course, is the complexity of the social ethnic landscape of Indonesia, where in the whole of Kalimantan, for instance, there's a neat division between the ethnic Dayak inland areas around here that straddle the border between Kalimantan and Sarawak, and then the periphery areas where we have communities that are settled by the quote-unquote trans-migrant communities, Javanese, Maduris, and people from other parts of Indonesia. This also accounts for the nature of voting and party political loyalties. During my fieldwork, during the elections there's a clear, neat divide. The further inland you go, particularly among the Dayak communities, you see an overwhelming support for Jokowi and the PDIP. Whereas in the periphery areas, Samarinda, Balikpapan, Banjarmasin, Pontianak, these urban areas are dominated by the trans-migrant communities from Java, from Sulawesi, and they tend to be more in favor of the opposition alliance led by Prabowo, the so-called Red and White coalition. So Indonesian society is divided along ethnic, religious lines and also party political loyalties that coincide with that. The practical realities on the ground, however, are the things that the Jokowi government is trying to address. And the reason why this is important is because for many people, millions of ordinary Indonesians, these are their real concerns. This was a bread and butter election. You need to translate ideals into practical working policies that deliver goods and services to the Indonesian people. So let's hop there from Kalimantan, we go to Sulawesi. Southeastern Sulawesi is an area where I've done a lot of field work, and it's actually quite adventurous. Any of you who want to join me for a holiday can join me there. Let's see. It's home of one of the most, among the many interesting communities of Indonesia, notably the Bajau Laut. Now, of course, I think some of us here are familiar with the Bajau Laut people. They are one of many historically maritime nomadic communities that exist in Southeast Asia. In many ways, the Badrol are a testimony to Southeast Asia's pre-modern, pre-nation state past. They are a reminder of a Southeast Asia before the advent of modernity and the modern nation state, because these are people who have a sense of regional belonging. And by virtue of the fact that for hundreds of years the Bajau Laut were basically sea nomads, their sense of identity was very much bonded to the sea. When I was doing fieldwork among the Bajau Laut, for instance, when you ask them, what's your homeland? My homeland is the sea. The sea is my home. They're a very interesting community to study. There have been several sociological, social anthropological studies of the Bajau Laut. Among the outstanding features of this community is that they are a nation that has not one but three myths of origin. Nations normally have one myth of origin, and we came from here. But for a lot of the Bajau Laut, they have multiple origins. On one account, they come from the Strait of Malacca. On another account, they come from the Philippines. On another account, they come from the Sulawesi Sea. It's a very interesting community, but it's a community that is a minority within the context of Indonesia's plural, multi-ethnic society. And what's interesting for the Bajau Laut is that it's one community whose political economy is very much tied to the natural environment, the maritime environment that they inhabit. By and large, up till the 1980s, there were still many Bajau Laut who did not have identity cards or passports, because they continue to move and they are bonded to the sea. That's why the Bajau Laut world basically extends from Sulawesi to Kalimantan to Sabah to the Philippines. We find them here in the Sulawesi Sea. The other interesting feature of this community, like some of the minority communities in Indonesia whose political economy is tied to the environment, is that they still remain until today very much tied to the economy of the sea, the maritime economy. If you look at the life of the ordinary Bajau Laut, one of the things that Bajau Laut are famous for is fishing sea cucumbers. I don't know how many of you eat this disgusting thing. I find it frankly quite slimy, dead or alive. But Bajau Laut, if you read Magellan's account, Antonio Piedepeta's account of Magellan's voyage to Southeast Asia in the 16th century, the Bajau Laut from the 16th century until today still fish for sea cucumbers in exactly the same way. They literally can actually walk on the surface of the water without any of this fancy scuba stuff that you guys buy from malls or whatever. They can just walk on the surface of the sea and pick up the sea cucumbers. And this, of course, makes them a very vulnerable community because they are a mono-commodity economy. They are dependent on the sea. And what would the demands of the Bajau Laut be? Well, the Bajau Laut, of course, by virtue of the fact that they are dependent upon maritime production, the fishing and sea cucumbers, are deeply worried about the encroachment of foreign vessels coming into Indonesian waters. This was, again, an issue that popped up during the election campaign when both sides of the political divide talked about the need for Indonesia to protect its maritime fishing territory. There is a zone here, just south of the Tomorrow Straits, which is specially allocated only for the Bajau Laut to protect them. But the external pressures through globalization that are impacting upon this community today are tremendous. The Bajau Laut are now relocated in floating villages, somewhat similar to what we see in places like Brunei or Sabah. Although culturally they're still bonded to the sea, they are economically now tied to the land. However, they face competition from other land-bound communities who play the role of brokers, buying the sea cucumbers that they fish in order to sell to foreign fishing vessels that are coming in. So what's going on is basically a trade of local maritime products that are then being bought by local non-Bajau brokers who then sell them to, say, Chinese fishing vessels so that the sea cucumbers end up in a restaurant in Hong Kong that night. And that's the pressure that the Bajaus feel. And that's also why increasingly across many parts of Indonesia, these local communities are making specific, community-specific demands upon the Indonesian state to protect their economic well-being. And that's why the maritime policy was so important. Let's go a bit further to Papua. In Papua, of course, those of us who are familiar with the history of Papua will be familiar with the rise of local ethnic political sentiments over there. And Papua is another classic case where you have this wide discrepancy between the local political economy and its dependency upon goods that are imported, services that are imported, and also facing competition from external capital coming into the country. Exactly the same logistical problems that Jokowi outlined in his election campaign. the cost of a ordinary cup of warm tea, teh kosong, yeah, in Yogyakarta, in a stall might be about 1,000 rupiah. When you get to Jayapura, it's 10,000 rupiah. It's the same tea. It's the same tea. I lost a lot of weight while doing work in a plate of rice, plain white rice, just plain white rice. It costs between 10 to 12,000 rupiah. That's 10 times the price in Jogja. Why? It's the same rice. It's the same rice. But why? Because it's being imported. And as it's being imported from one part of Indonesia to the outer provinces, the ones who make the profits are the local cartels who control logistics. Now, these are the real challenges that Indonesia faces for it to economically take off. And it's interesting to note that during the election campaign, both candidates, Jokowi and Prabowo, talked about the need for Indonesia to get its logistical act together. It was very telling that 2 years ago, presidential candidate Prabowo was in Singapore. And during his speech in Singapore, he said something very similar to what Jokowi said during his election campaign, that Indonesia has a time window. Has a time window of 10 years to get its logistical act together, because failure to do so would basically mean that the delivery of goods and services, energy security, communications and communications infrastructure will not be in place fast enough for Indonesia to capitalize on the current advantage that it has. Indonesia's oil reserves, its gas reserves will last only about 32 years, after which it falls back on coal. So Indonesia now, like many countries in Southeast Asia, is a net oil importer. It needs to conserve its resources in order to achieve this takeoff. And if the takeoff does not happen within the space of this